Hey everyone, welcome to Love, Rinse, Repeat, a podcast recorded on gay Omegal land by me, Liam Miller, he, him, his, a minister in the Uniting Church in Australia. Love, Rinse, Repeat is proudly supported by Uniting Mission and Education, and I thank them for their ongoing support. My guest today, joining us from across the pond, is the wonderful Thia Cooper. Thea, welcome along.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, for those who don't know, Thea Cooper is Professor of Religion at Gustavus Adolphus College. Professor Cooper undertook her Master of Theology at Edinburgh's New College in 1999 and completed her PhD in 2005, both under Marcella Althaus-Reid, which is a key important note because today we are discussing her new book, Queer and Indecent, An Introduction to Marcella Althaus-Reid, which is out now through SCM Press. She's also the book author of a host of other books, including A Christian Guide to Liberating Desire, Sex, Partnership, Work, and Reproduction. And I'm very excited to have you on
Very
the
long
podcast.
title.
Yeah.
Thank
I think
you.
I remember sharing that. Like I took a photo of it when I bought that with one of the Palgrave sales. I bought a few books, and someone was like, "Wow, Professor Cooper's, taking on a very modest project
Yes,
there."
it is a very modest task, and I just wanted to call it "Liberating Sex," but that might have been a little too exciting a title, and too brief. It's also, good to warn people what they're about to read
Mm,
rather than just surprising them. So,
yeah.
yes, the editor chose that title, and it's totally fine. But I always shorten it. I'm like, it's a guide to sex.
Yeah, that's great. And I think about your sales would have been if you just Thea Cooper's Guide to Sex. I think you definitely
Ooh,
piqued
gosh,
some
yeah.
interest. So
Oh, yeah.
let's start with Queer and Indecent. So I guess just I'm curious about like the process of coming toward this book, and maybe your broad hopes for it, as you began to engage this to try to write an introduction of this kind. I'm sure there's a million ways you probably thought and wrestled with how you'd go about
Ah.
this and how you'd organize it. So I guess just talk a bit about the leading into the process and your hopes for the work.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I'm so excited that it looks so beautiful. It took ages to find that painting of the person who actually did that painting. Unfortunately, I came across her. She's a Brazilian woman. I
Mm-hmm.
was able to find her and get permission, so that was super
Oh,
exciting.
great.
Um, how did the book happen? So it actually started, and I think I mentioned this maybe in the introduction or the acknowledgments, but I was having coffee with a friend of mine who's a Methodist minister. And I had lent him a couple of Marcella's books, and we talked a little about the introductions, and we're sort of wrestling with some of the concepts. And I said, God, I should really just write like a journal article that kind of says, here's kind of the basic stuff you would want to know before you dive into this. Because she had such a breadth of knowledge, right? And she brought so many different academic analyses in. And he said to me, he's like, I think that would be a book rather than a journal article. And I was like, no, no. And then I started thinking, and I started making a list, and this book totally appealed to my research side, because when I do research, I want to try to read everything there is out there on the topic, and normally that's impossible. But with Marcella's work, she had, right, 3 books and then about 50 chapters and articles that she'd written, and so I was, actually able to
Mm.
get access to most, if not all of it, and then read through it. And so as I started reading and rereading, and making lists of possible things I would talk about, I realized that my friend Andy was totally right, that this was going to be a book, and also that there was no way that I could or would even want to try to talk about everything Marcella
Mhm.
did, because obviously you would read Marcella's work to figure that out. But she was my PhD supervisor. So I actually met her even before I started the master's in theology. I interviewed with her at the University of Edinburgh and was like, whoa, there's a liberation theologian, and it's so exciting because I had met with other people prior to this, mainly in the US, who were sort of like, what, liberation theology is dead, why would you even want to study this? And
Mm.
then I met Marcella, and there was like a real live liberationist, so super exciting. So she ended up being my PhD supervisor, very gently led me into liberation theology because I was a very nice white lady who, although I'd grown up very poor, I didn't understand a lot of the other, right, various forms of oppression. I didn't even really think much about gender oppression until I was a student rep at the Faculty of Divinity, and it was just kind of funny. There were very few women at the time in the faculty, and so my voice, not only being a student voice but also a female voice, was a little bit like, when I heard myself talk, I thought, whoa, that's totally different than others in the room. And then Marcella also would be quite vibrant at times. So I really, I knew that her work, although she was only able to write, for about maybe, 12 or 13 years before she died, unfortunately, her work had followed a trajectory, was continuing to expand. And was really far ahead of its time. I mean, certainly when I was studying under her, I did not appreciate fully what she was doing. And so it's only now, right, 15 years, 20 years later, that I think, oh, okay, transgender, I get this. Like, I understand, or thinking about people who are totally excluded from the system rather than just marginalized. So I thought, what the heck can I say that will help draw people in?
Mm.
My goal really was twofold. One, to get people to want to read Marcella's work, because I think sometimes we tend to forget about people who have written 10 or 15 years ago. But often for many liberationists who are thinking so differently from other people around them, it really takes that time for people to process and understand.
Mhm.
And then the second piece was for people to realize that there's actually a whole bunch of her work out there, apart from the two books, which are the most famous. And a lot of the chapters and articles she wrote
Mm.
are much more easily accessible, I think, than the more formal to academic books. So.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for that. And I think what's helpful is throughout the book, in the at the end of each chapter, you have some suggested reading, and a lot of that is drawing attention to articles that you wouldn't otherwise, probably a lot of people wouldn't otherwise know, but yes, can be found
Yeah.
and really helpful. How was the process? I guess often we research things that or research writers that we've never met or haven't engaged, and you're engaged in this both in the sense of, okay, there's this corpus of work that I can now engage,
Mm-hmm.
but also there's this person who was obviously, as you just already shared, very influential in shaping who you are
Yeah.
as a theologian and as an
Yeah.
academic. So how did you find navigating, I guess, that mix?
Well, the first bit is it made me miss her horribly.
Mm.
I was already devastated because she was such an important mentor. And then to read a lot of the things, especially some of the chapters in the articles that I hadn't read before, my first response was, now I want to ask her all these questions and I didn't even know. Okay. Um, what I most appreciate is that the way that she taught, um, and how do I say this? The way that she taught actually helps me understand her writing. So, one of the things I always say to my students when I'm teaching is that often when you read academic books in general, but in particular, academic books by people of color, by women, female scholars, people who are not your traditional European or US wealthy white men, often they are actually far more formal in tone and have to prove they can cite all 1,500 people who came before them before they can then say what they want to say, right? There's sort of this sense of, if I am a liberationist, I have to show that I know the whole traditional canon before I can then talk about liberation theology, which is flawed and is one of the things Marcella critiques. But I think what happens often for many of us is that we have almost that mechanism where we show what we know and then we say where it takes us, right? I mean, it's expected in academic writing. And so I think engaging with Marcella's books in particular can be tricky because she had to really show, right, how she was bringing these various forms of academic knowledge together before she could simply say what she was trying to say. And there's less of that sometimes in the chapter she wrote for other books or some of the articles where she was just able to tackle a theme and move forward with it. I've tried to be super conscious of that in my own writing. I even had that drama a little bit in my PhD because I did some field work during my PhD and I wanted the actual product to be relevant to the people I was working with. And it turns out that writing for, you know, a PhD committee and writing for the people you're working with are two very different things. So, but yeah, so navigating that I think was made actually far easier by knowing her, because in her own context, when she was teaching or talking, she could say straightforwardly, here is what I'm thinking. And then that academic writing, you know, sort of talked a lot about where it came from and how it intersected with others. So it was tricky. And then I also just had to make lots of lists of here's what I'm going to talk about and here's what I'm not going to talk about to actually keep myself on task and keep the book to a manageable length.
Well, it certainly is. And I think it really does. It really is an excellent introduction, an excellent way in for folks. Because I think I've often, like, you know, when people are talking about, like, you know, recommending different kinds of queer theology or things for people out there, there's often that question of like, oh, I've heard of Marcella Althaus-Reid, but I don't think I would be able to engage, like, you know, is that readable, or is that, you know, the questions that come up. And I think this book really shows you a way in, and is very helpful as that kind of a wading into a vaster ocean.
Yeah.
In that you open up the conclusion with this great line, which is Althaus-Reid wanted us to upend our ideas of what is normal by focusing on real experiences. And I think, you know, of all the things that I guess, you know, one of the things that really, I guess, yeah, does, where you say is ahead of her time and really blew open a lot of doors. And one thing that, you know, also helped with that work she was doing in challenging liberation and feminist theologies of the time was to go, you know, was that real attention to lived experiences, and particularly real experiences of folks who were, as you say, not just marginalized, but completely excluded. Can you just talk to us, for folks who aren't really familiar or aware, a bit of that kind of aspect of Marcella's work, of that real attention to real experiences and how that shaped and both her critique and, I guess, her constructive project?
Absolutely. So, so it first stems, you know, from the method of liberation theology itself, which is I can think whatever I want to think, but it's what I'm doing that shows what I really believe, right? So I can think and say that I'm on the side of the poor, or, you know, I want to end poverty, but it's what I'm doing in my everyday life that really shows, right? It's what I do in my everyday life that either builds or destroys my relationship with God. It's not what I say to God, right? It's my actual, like, God's kind of smart and knows what's going on. Is you know how we think about this within the Christian tradition, and so what happens a lot within theology is that with two things. One is we tend to want to find kind of simple framing definitions, right? How should I behave? What is sin? What is salvation? Like, give me an answer. There are a lot of people on the planet in a lot of different situations. And there is not going to be one answer. And so actually thinking through what is happening in these real situations is going to tell us a lot more about our relationship with God and each other than any sort of dogma or should piece that's coming down from above. And one of the things Marcella really appreciated about liberation theology, particularly in its early years, and feminist theology in its early years, was this sense of that we do want to actually talk. We want to talk with the poor. Of course, when I say we, it's a non-poor, right? Going to talk with the poor. Or in feminist theology, of course, what ended up happening was white middle class US and European women ended up dominating, right? So we kind of reproduce these things. So two pieces have to come out of this. One is to recognize that there is not one normative experience, and then every other experience is abnormal, right? Normal is just what we've decided the dominant thing should be, which tends to exclude most of us. You're thinking when I first started talking about, when you're in a tenure track position and trying to get tenure, if you don't already have them, you develop some mental health issues. And I remember talking to a few of my colleagues about, oh yeah, I've started seeing a therapist. Holy moly. Pretty much everyone else I spoke to was also seeing a therapist. But it was, it was seen as abnormal, even though it was the majority of people who were needing, help to actually struggle through these situations. And so normative, as well as sort of rule setting from above, is very problematic because it doesn't come out of what's actually happening with us. And doesn't enable us, I think, to connect to each other or really communicate with each other because we hide so much of what we see as not normal. And so that's kind of, that's where Marcella's starting point is theology is not about trying to grow churches or, have however many million Christians in the world. Theology is actually about connecting us to each other and to God. And we can only actually do that if we start to look at what our own experiences are and share those with each other.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's really
Mhm.
helpful. I think something that's interesting you're touching on there is, so when I started to read the book, okay, there's a very short biography chapter, kind of introduction, then a short biography chapter. Then the kind of next chapter is kind of a surprise for some in terms of progression, in that it's the theological marketplace. So before we're getting into, the work itself, it's this. But I think what's so important is the way that, you show that Marcella thought that basically the way theology is done in the sense that we think about theology as a discipline is counter much of what you've just said we're trying to do, right? It doesn't support a liberate, trying to be a liberation theology and trying to be about liberation means you need to be like in community and able to do activism, and the academic life doesn't support that because it moves you around and doesn't want you to be loud and all that kind of stuff. And you are part necessarily of this capitalist system that you have to take experience and put it into a book that you value from, it's a really helpful, not only wading into what she was wrestling with, but what the situation that we're all in, that
Yes.
despite whatever we're going to try to do, we are trapped in here. So I guess talk to us a bit about the theological marketplace, and I guess especially as a way that it complicates all these very best intentions.
So the irony, if I'm using irony in its appropriate way, is that the ironic thing would be to actually develop a career as a liberation theologian, right? And I often joke with my students that I am a faux liberationist. I mean, I hope that's not true, right? But there are definitely aspects of my life, of all our lives, right, where we are hypocritical and not certainly my own lived experience, right, is not the same as the lived experience of someone who is homeless, living under a bridge, and so this is a really, and I struggle with this all the time, and I think many activists do, is this balance between yes, I want to be able to teach, I want to be able to research, but my purpose for teaching and research is to try to upend the horrific systems of power that are seen as normal. In order to teach and be published, I have to participate in those systems. So I have to get tenure, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have to, no, I don't have to, but I became a full professor. And now I'm a professor of religion, and I've published some books, and it's important to write so that other people can read.
Mm-hmm.
But I am part of this capitalist system. I am part of this heterosexual system. I'm part of this patriarchal system, right? I'm part of this racist system. And so this is the tension, right, that we're living with, is that we're both part of the system and we're trying to struggle against it. And so constantly trying to balance that and remind ourselves of what we're actually trying to do is really difficult, right? It's hard to kind of hold your headspace or your I don't want to call it sanity, because I'm not even sure what sanity is, right? But sort of about halfway through a semester of teaching my students, I have to step back and think, am I helping them to unpack these systems of power, or am I still trying to transmit some specific form of knowledge, right? When I write a book, am I, do I get halfway through and find that I'm suddenly lecturing on what you should think about X? Or am I still trying to just open up the possibilities, right? And it's really difficult. And I think Marcella felt it, and I think a lot of us feel it, that most of us can't be completely outside the system, right? Most of us are both going to be exploited by these various systems, but also exploiting others. Simply, in my existence, right, I benefit from certain things that others don't. And it's hard to, if not nearly impossible, to actually remove both the privilege and the oppression, right, as an individual. So.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that is helpful, and it was well laid out in that chapter. And so moving to another thing, I was thinking about, if we talked about this idea of, trying to draw attention to or not ignore those parts of the, community that are fully excluded, or messy up our nice, neat, conceptual, this is what things are.
Mm-hmm.
Marcella also does that with the body. Rather that so I remember reading a Lisa Isherwood chapter on Marcella, where she kind of said Marcella challenging feminist theologians to stop focusing on the womb and turn their attention to the vagina. That was a necessary, that we've kind of, the woman's body had been kind of either essentialized or just like made neat by certain focus. And there's a point where you're talking here about for Althaus-Reid, theology also ignores the hairy armpit, because hairy armpits refuse to follow the status quo. So I'm curious to get your insights a bit and talk to us a bit about this attention to the body and bodies in ways that, like, I guess again, this challenge and this attention to the fullness and the messiness.
So Christianity has this weird combination of both wanting to prioritize the soul over the body, or the spirit over the body, but also being super obsessive about what we can and cannot do with our bodies, right? I mean, if you just take, for example, in the US, and not in many other countries now, but in the US, for example, right, most young boys are circumcised. And this is very normal in the US. And when I say this to my European friends, like, why would you do that? Right. And no one certainly, in terms of theologies in the US, right, challenges this mutilation of young boys. But yet the Christian tradition has been very obsessed with what our bodies should be like, what is appropriate, particularly for women, although for men as well, right? So menstruation for a long time was seen as, impure, rather than like, it means we can actually reproduce and like create anyway. And this changes over time, right? So when the European women came over as colonizers, being hairy was actually a positive for the women, because it meant they could actually grow body hair in ways that indigenous women did not, right? So the indigenous women remained children because they were hairless, whereas the colonizing females, right, they grew body hair. Now we're not so fond of female body hair. And there's also an odd way in which the Christian tradition is quite happy to shift its notion in some aspects of how we change our bodies, but then not in others, right? So, okay, most of us no longer follow the biblical exhortation as women to not cut our hair, right? We cut our hair, we trim our nails. We might get nose jobs or boob jobs, but God forbid you should touch the genitalia other than for male circumcision, right? Like, don't actually change, don't remove the penis, don't, all of these things that comes with, being transgender or attempting to change sex is suddenly like, no, like that's the thing we can't do, right? We can do all these other things and we should do some of them. But suddenly we put a limit, right? So suddenly it's like, but no, you're created in the image of God. Okay. What about all the rest of the stuff? And so I think Marcella had two perspectives on this. One was that you can't actually sort of hearken back to the ideal body, because quite frankly, in the Christian tradition, there has never been an actual ideal body. And so thinking of not changing ourselves in that way, just, it doesn't make sense. But the second thing is that we really need to overcome this sort of hatred or denigration of the body that happens, not just in the Christian tradition, but particularly in the Christian tradition. I am I am in my body, right? I'm gonna have to learn to at least deal with it, maybe change some of it, but certainly come to terms with it, if not deeply love it. And this is something that is really important that we don't often do, and I think then, right, makes us uncomfortable with our sexuality and all sorts of other things, because we're not even comfortable with our bodily existence to begin with. So the body, if we're created in the image of God, if God actually came to earth and took on, became human as Jesus, like, you can't then say the human body is horrific. So there's a lot to unpack there, that we haven't done well in the Christian tradition, and I think it opens up a lot of areas to really celebrate the body, but also be much more open to the whole variety of bodies that exist. Again, if you go back to that, what is normal, right? I mean, what we consider as able-bodied versus disabled, or anything like that. Like, who is tall and who is short? What's supposed to be the appropriate height? What's supposed to be the appropriate, just all of these things that we set as normative, as if somehow there has to be one static definition, I think is really detrimental, to our own experience of knowing each other, but also to knowing God as well.
Thank you for that. That's really helpful. And I think, as you say, like, that discomfort with or outright disdain for the body, or at least this kind of complete ignoring of, I'm a person in my body, and what does that mean, obviously then has this play out on theology, right? On the theology that people produce, in their ignoring of the body, ignoring of their desire, allows for very different, complete, like, just overlooking of very obvious things. I think of, like, I think it's in Lynn Marie Tonstad's Queer Theology, it talks about, like, had Bart been more attentive to whatever he was desiring, that and whatever was going on in his home life at the time he's running the church dogmatics, then maybe he'd have come to the ordering of the genders a bit differently, had this attention being paid. So and so I guess I'm thinking then about Marcella talks, early in the Queer God, she's talking about, that the way that desire can get crossed over, right? That, you're thinking about an old lover while reciting the Nicene Creed, or whatever it might be, or these things kind of intermingle.
Yeah.
And I guess that's an important thing I'd be interested to talk about, the way that just that, that we do our thinking of God amidst all our other things. Right. I actually have a note. Yeah. I was reading about a section about that in your book, and I wrote a note that, like, in the margins, I'm reading this while, like, the Wiggles is playing in the background, and I'm being a neglectful father. And another one child's watching the Wiggles, the other is crawling over my feet at the desk. But that's what's happening at this moment, that I consider this way of thinking about God. Like, so I guess talk to us a bit about that, and the way. I guess the way that you would encourage people to think about how that is okay, freeing,
absolutely,
and how people might move in that, open to that.
So again, I think this sometimes comes from our assumption that body and soul are separate, right? We like dualisms for some reason in the West, right? We like good and bad, black and white. Like, we like to kind of separate things out. But we don't really think about God separately to thinking about other things, right? We may want to, and I actually say in my book on sex, right? Many of my students have said to me, like, no. One does not think about God when one is having sex. That's just too weird. Which is kind of funny if you actually, in the Christian tradition, think about God as being present, because whether or not you want to think about God in that situation, right? God is there, whatever's happening. And I think, how do I say this? I think we would like there to be something formal out there that is God and a set of rules often, because it's much harder to, in every moment of my existence, remember that I'm actually with God, that God is with me, right? That God is in this conversation. Um, and I think we often find that intimidating, in part because we have this notion of God, which is another thing that Marcella critiques, is like somehow up there above, and human beings are in this horrible debt to God that we're never going to get out of. And, only God's salvation can rescue us. Um, and it's also possible to think of ourselves just in mutual relationship with God. Like God wants us as much as we want God. God is just present, you know. But I think it's very difficult, right? We're not taught in that way. We're also not in general taught about intersections between a lot of the different parts of our lives, right? So my sex life is over here, my economic life is over here, my student life is here. It doesn't actually work like that, but that's somehow what we're supposed to deal with it, right? You compartmentalize, you put things in their little boxes. um and whilst that might make life easier were it to be true, it's not true. And I
Mhm.
think it causes us a lot of mental anguish,
Mm.
right, when we try to keep those things separate. And so thinking about sex, thinking about God, thinking about my next cup of coffee, which I'm thinking about right now because that's pretty much what I always think about. Um, those are all intertwined. They are not separate aspects of my life, at all.
Mm.
And my desire for coffee, my desire for another human being, is all part of my general desire to experience life, to experience God, to experience others.
Mm.
This is all connected.
Mm. That's really helpful. It's interesting. We were talking before we started recording about some of the demands we've seen, some professors put on students in terms of Zoom etiquette of like, you need to be in this
Yes.
like quiet, sanitized space in order to do Zoom. It's
Right.
like, well, it completely ignores
Right.
the actual material reality of folks. It completely ignores how we learn in general. Like, and I think that's, an example of this. We
Right.
want to be able to say like, this is that part of your life, and everything else should be able to shut off now. And I mean, not
Right.
only does that
Right.
cause anguish, as you say, it just naturally is going to exclude a whole bunch of folks. And yeah,
Right.
I think that's an
It's
interesting.
also particularly funny if you're in a classroom and you're talking about things like gender and sex and religion,
Mhm.
to then expect any of us to shut off parts of our life, right? That's exactly what the whole system is trying to do. So if I am in a classroom saying, "Oh, don't think about the fact that, your mom just lost her job or your dog just died." It's like, no,
Yeah.
what we are trying to do is learn how to become more deeper thinking, better human beings, and
Mm.
that doesn't mean cutting off parts of what we're experiencing. It means bringing them in and coping with them.
Yes.
Just, yeah.
Yeah, and this is going to lead to having a more being able to approach things more freely then, because you're
Right.
not trying to like wrestle it in. um when you're talking about like sex and gender in class, I was thinking about like just how much different that class is going to be if you're in the class with like someone you got a crush on compared to if you don't, like that your whole
Yes.
experience of discussion of sex and
Yes.
what you choose to say, how you interpret what people say, like
Yes.
how you
Yes.
try to moderate your body
Yes.
language, like it's all like these things totally transform, like
Oh
I
gosh.
definitely remember like lessons
Absolutely.
I've learned based on like people who were in and like what they said, or you know or the alternative, you remember those embarrassing moments that you've said, and they stick with you
Oh,
pedagogically, like somehow, like
yes.
um yeah.
I won't share on camera and recorded my most embarrassing pedagogical moments, but I have them. I do have them. And I do. Yes, I do.
uh,
It's funny that you say that because I have had students, before say, okay, so do we actually have to share with the rest of the class what we're writing our papers on? Or do we, because often
mm,
students want to research things or test out new perspectives. And as I said before we started recording as well, right? It's only once you actually start writing something and publish it that you realize that this is a process, right? You may think that in the moment, but it doesn't mean that your thinking won't shift. And so certainly with issues of race, class, gender, etc. I've had students who are like, I really want to write about this, I really want to think about this, but I don't want necessarily everybody to be involved in my thinking process. And part of that is because we are, for lack of a better word, we do tend to be very judgy, right? Which of course we shouldn't be. But I think we often are. And so that openness and that freeness that you're talking about, I think, is often not celebrated in academic spaces. Not only are there particular things you're supposed to learn and particular ways you're supposed to learn, but often new and different ideas are critiqued rather than celebrated, which is problematic, particularly in theology. As I said, like you have to follow the line of the 1500 who came before you, and then you can do this one little thing differently, which is yeah. Maybe not the way our real lives work.
No, very true. So talk a bit about the you have a chapter toward the end on a marginal God. And this idea that Christianity, this is from Althaus-Reid, Christianity is a religion built around a destitute God who came for destitute people. And I guess part of what you're demonstrating here through her work is this idea of God not being at the center. That there's this kind of almost a kind of an image of, we put God right in the middle, and then we put a box around that middle, and that delineates where God is and where the rightness of humanity and our concepts lie, and stuff like that. So talk to us a bit about this idea of moving God, because some people say, oh, God has to be the center because that's what God is, right? So talk to us a bit about the God not being in the center, and I guess why that's actually good news.
So if I pretend to be a geographer at the moment, one of the things that happens, of course, with mapping, right, is that when you map a space, you map it from your own perspective. So if you see a flat map of the world produced in the US or produced by Europe, it may look very different to a flat map of the world if it were to be produced by an Australian, right? Just what we center, what we see as the edges, right? How we actually present that space. And I think a lot more people are aware of this today, right? When you look at a map, when you make a map, there are certain decisions that have to be made, and every map is going to show some bias, right? And you have to be pretty clear, or hopefully you would want to be clear about what that bias is. We don't do that very well with theology, in terms of first of all, we don't even acknowledge that we are the humans creating the map, right? There's often this sense of somehow I or someone else gets a direct line to God, and now I know what God is saying. So that's awkward, first of all, in and of itself. Because humans are finite and God is infinite, so the Christian tradition says. So that's making some difficult assumptions. Second of all, I can only see, and this is Marcella's perspective as well, I can only understand God from my own perspective. And this is why being with others, living with others is so important, right? Because you are also understanding God from your perspective. And it's only by us experiencing God together that we actually get a slightly larger picture of God. What has happened in the mainstream Christian traditions is that God has been sort of framed in these particular Western ways. So Marcella talks about how we think about redemption from sin in these economic ways, these capitalist ways, which is weird. That we often have God as like the benevolent grandfather or something, which for those people without benevolent grandfathers, not a helpful metaphor. What we do is narrow and narrow and narrow. And this is one of the things I really like about Minjung theology. I don't know if you're at all familiar with Korean Minjung theology, but this kind of notion that it's almost that God has been imprisoned and we actually need to rescue God and Jesus from this imprisonment. And so thinking about God as a God that has, rather than that God actually being in the center, that we think God is in the center, in fact, by creating this small construct and box for God, we actually have exiled God. So God is no longer right here because God is so much bigger and more expansive, right? God is living at the margins with the marginalized, expanding, flowing, becoming, in ways that we at the center do not understand, cannot comprehend. And so it's almost like we've shoved God to one side while still saying that we put him, right, our male God, at the center. But so this concept of a marginal God is simply to say that God is ebbing and flowing and becoming. God is not static. God is not the same. God can't be put in a box. And so when you do that, you end up with an idol or a false God, whilst God's self is actually being experienced by humans at the margins, simply because people at the margins, as we call them, are open to God in ways that many of us are not. So it's not that God has chosen to leave us, right? It's that we are not open to actually seeing God or actually experiencing God, if that makes sense.
Yes, no, very, very much does. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, thinking about, having spent the time on this project and read, so much, Marcella, and you kind of led off with, how in so many ways she was ahead of her time, and how that, broke open a lot of things. Now thinking it's, 2021, so we're 12 years after she died.
12 years.
Where do you see her, like, do you feel like theology, like, obviously a lot hasn't, but like has much like heeded what she was trying to do? Have you seen shifts? Do you still think like she's shone a light in a trajectory, but that trajectory wasn't taken up in ways that it could? I'm just curious where you see now things, how things are situated now, and what she was trying to encourage theologians to do.
Oh gosh, great question. Woulda, coulda, shoulda is super difficult, right? Okay, so there are a couple of things. One is I would think that so one of the things that I have been very critical of is this is going to sound terrible, is the move for same-sex marriage. Not because I am in any way opposed to same-sex marriage, but because marriage as a construct is horrific in so many ways, damaging to many people. And so one of the things that Marcella also talked about was this sense that we need not to, how do I explain this? So one of the problems with inclusion is that we want to bring people into the center, right? We want to bring, please feel free to be part of my community, right? Be sort of enough like me so that I'm still comfortable, right? Maybe change a tiny bit, but don't make me actually expand the community, right? You come in, you be included, but let's not go this way. And I think that's partly what sort of happened, particularly in the U.S., with same-sex marriage was a sense of, okay, come be part of this system that we have decided is the basic construct for society, rather than, I mean, certainly in the UK and other countries, right, far fewer people are getting married, right? That's sort of, that may no longer be the basic construct of society. And so I think in terms of the way that we're thinking theologically, we still are in, the liberationists like myself often are in a mode of trying to see how we can include, how we can welcome people in, and we're still failing to actually go out to, right, leave where I am. So that it's not a question of how can I make African Americans feel welcome in this community, right? It's how does this community need to change, right? How should African Americans change this community, right? So that they can live and survive and thrive. So it's not about me going and welcoming someone else. It's about, actually moving out and expanding. And I think theologically, we're still really struggling with that. And I think we also still, we still would like to have a simple definition of sin, a simple definition of salvation, right? Complexities are really difficult to deal with. Change is really difficult to deal with. Certainly one of the other things that I think apart from sexuality, Marcella also talked a lot in the context of sexuality and of economics, but talked a lot about indigenous perspectives, right? Certainly in the US, we have epically failed to deal with our ongoing colonization of the indigenous here. And I know other countries struggle with that too, right? So there are ways in which our theologies are still tiptoeing around a lot of issues rather than tackling them head on. And so, we still have transgender issues, we still have racial issues, we still have colonization. There is a whole host of things that we're still not making a lot of progress on. But I mean, it's all right. We're human. We need to work toward it. But I think one of the reasons why I wanted to work on this book was because Marcella pushed forward so many of these boundaries, and there are so many that areas that she worked in that we haven't even seen as boundaries yet, right? We don't even often acknowledge that there's a lot, I think, that we still need to tackle. It was a long answer to your
But it was
question.
a very good answer, and I think and a great endorsement for the book. Yes, I was thinking just at the last bit, just to share that line that you have right toward the end of the conclusion. For Althaus-Reid, the goal is not to formulate one theology, but to celebrate the diverse ways of knowing God. And I think, that's been a great encouragement through this conversation. So, folks, if you've ever thought, I really want to, understand and read and get into Marcella Althaus-Reid, this is the book to get you there, to start you off. Thea Cooper's Queer and Indecent, an Introduction to Marcella Althaus-Reid. It's really wonderful. And as you said, there were so many chapters, so many boundaries and borders and topics that we didn't even cover that would be a conversation in themselves. And it's really accessible, has each chapter ends with suggested reading. Look at that, not too Thea did her job and kept it to a very
long.
not too long.
It's in paperback.
Look at that. Lots of reasons to get it. There's very few hurdles to jump over, folks. So pick up the book. Thea, thank you for coming on the podcast. Is there anything else you'd like to promote or draw our attention to at this moment?
No, I mean, I would say one of the things that I'm working on at the moment, there are a couple of things that I think I'd love for other people to take forward. One is I think we do need to do a lot of work, certainly on reproductive justice. So notions of reproduction, it comes up a lot in Marcella's work. It's also come up before in my work. The other thing, which I may get to if I don't die of old age first, but I would love to see what I would like to call a theology of the cervix, right? We were talking about how often we think about women as like womb or, whatever. But I think, thinking about particular areas of women's bodies that we have ignored, I think is super important. And just trying to imagine how we might talk about God without using male language. Not because there's anything wrong with male language, but just because we've done that for a long time, right? So actually trying to imagine let's just say cervix, go from there. So anyway, suggestions for, people who want to do fun theology.
There you go. Maybe someone's looking for a PhD supervisor, they can reach out to Thea. But no, that's really great. I think, yeah, it touches on so much of what this whole book and this conversation is about. Is there's just so many things that are just completely ignored or elided or obfuscated in theology that are just absolute everyday essential part of our lives. And the better we can hold things together, the better our lives will be, the work for justice will be, and our talk on God will be. So thank you for encouraging us. I hope folks feel that way. Folks, get the book, and Thea, we'll have to have you on again sometime.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
No worries. See you all next week, folks.